Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're here to do another sort of in conversation with looking at the issues that are affecting CLA members. Today, we're going to talk about devolution, which has become a hot topic in Parliament. Everyone's talking about devolution and the new devolution bill. But what does devolution actually mean? So I'm Eleanor Wood. I'm the Senior Public Affairs Manager at the CLA, and I'm joined by Dr. Charles Trotman, who is our Chief Economist, and Henry Welch, our Public Affairs Advisor, to sort of talk through the issues and what it means for CLA members. I think fundamentally we hear devolution thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean as a concept, and what are people talking about when they say devolution and we'll have more devolution and devolution is the future for the Labour Party? Charles?
Thank you, Ellie. Good afternoon, Ellie, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it's quite simple when we look at devolution, but I think we also got to remember that devolution isn't a new concept. When we go through this podcast, you'll see that we're talking about a different form of devolution, but essentially, devolution means moving power or decision making away from the centre to local decision makers. So in the case that we're going to be talking about today, that means moving power away from Whitehall and essentially giving it to county councils or power centred at a local level. You know, the general idea is that local areas have a far better grasp of the problems they actually encounter. Certainly than national government does. And in a sense, you could say that local problems should in fact be solved by local solutions. Now, if we're looking at what's happening actually now, we know that the government has just published the Devolution Bill, which will essentially set out its desire to promote devolution and obviously give more powers to local decision making. But the question that we have to essentially try and answer is how would this model of devolution, which is different than it has been in the past, and which will give more powers to elected mayors, more powers to combined local authorities. How will that actually impact rural communities and rural businesses?
I think that's the question of the day. What is it going to all lead to? I think if we were going to look at where it's going to go, let's look at where we are right now. What examples are there out there of places that have already taken advantage of these sort of devolution deals?
Well, I certainly can give you a few examples of where devolution actually hasn't worked, but that wasn't your question. It's more a case that we need to look at the mayoral authorities in the large urban centres such as London, Manchester, and Liverpool. And we hear a lot about, certainly in London, about Sadiq Khan, the current mayor of London, how important a position that is. And certainly within that devolution model, mayors have been given the power to seek investment into their urban areas, essentially to try and create regeneration or regenerate those local areas and provide essential public services. But it does actually underline a problem, and that problem is the focus or the priority is urban. And we've seen this for many, many years in different areas of policy. And unfortunately, it's coming through clearly in devolution. We had it with regional development agencies under the Blair administration. We had it with local enterprise partnerships. And we seem to be adopting the same approach that local authorities tend to focus mainly on urban areas. But it's I think the case that when we look at this, we have to recognise that although there may be a large urban area, it is very likely to have a very large rural hinterland. And I think the key certainly for us, is getting the message across that reality can actually lead to economic impetus and growth. And that's one of the key challenges that we have. I think one of the growing problems is that as mayors get more devolved funding and powers with the potential to improve local decision making, this is what essentially we are talking about here. The process is actually moving at multiple speeds, with rural areas often the last to benefit. So if we go through four kind of stages, we have the established big metro mayors such as Manchester, which I've already mentioned, who have large devolved budgets and wide-ranging powers. We've got a new group of recent mayors with smaller budgets and powers. Thirdly, we've got some areas who are actually going to get a mayor in the next 2 to 3 years. And then finally, we come to those other areas, mainly rural, as in the southwest of the country, where the actual process hasn't really started off at all. So it's a kind of, in a sense, the process itself is devolved. It's gradual, it's evolutionary in the sense that it will develop. But the concern that we would have, and this is again something that we will be addressing later, is that we need to understand how we can get rural, whether it be rural communities or rural economies and rural businesses, into the debate, how we can engage and how we can actually push the policy process forward. Because it's only by doing that will our members actually see tangible and real benefits from the devolution models being put forward by the current government.
Okay, hold that thought, Charles. We're coming back to it, and we'll talk a lot about how the CLA will be influencing devolution going forward. I think it'd be helpful. So, if I was the average member, to be wondering what sort of powers are being given out. You know, what's different from Westminster that these powers are available to local areas. Henry, do you have any thoughts on this?
So what we've had so far with devolution deals is we've got the devolution of things like transport and skills, planning, housing, and that's being given power to local mayors and local combined authorities. What I think is most interesting and probably most important for CLA members is the devolution of economic development. So each of these local mayors will have the ability to do a local growth plan, and they will do that in devise with stakeholders in different groups and hopefully people like the CLA. And what that will do is basically choose to how they want to improve the economic situation in their local area. With kind of what things that Charles was saying earlier, what we'll get is we'll get different forms of devolution in each one of these areas. So as you kind of mentioned, some of the bigger devolved areas, such as Greater Manchester, we've already seen devolution of things like local buses. So Andy Burnham's taken buses both back into public services. We look at Tees Valley, and a massive priority over there is the Tees Valley regeneration projects, and going over Teesside and making sure that old brownfield land is being regenerated. And what we're going to get is basically different forms of economic development in different areas, depending on the priority of the mayor and their combined authority.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that as well, I think we need to look at past examples of this. So recently we've had the Rural England Prosperity Fund. So this is part of what was called the UK Share Prosperity Fund in order to essentially to share around the opportunities for economic growth, but at a more local level. Now we had a total of nearly 90 odd local authorities having funds under the REPF. And unfortunately, we had 90 different approaches. There was no consistency, there was no uniformity there. And I think it's important that with the devolution plans going forward now, that the government understands and the government realizes it needs to learn the lessons. We know that the REPF was not administered certainly as well as we would hope it would have been administered. And our concern, obviously, with that, irrespective of the fact it was a rural-based scheme, is that many organisations who had the knowledge and experience of the rural economy were not actually part of the engagement process. So we need to actually get really the basic building blocks right before we can kick on.
I think talking of engagement, I think we will have members sat at home now going, I wonder what my local area is doing. Am I going to get a mayor? Am I going to have a unitary authority? Is there a way of looking it up? You know, is there a way of finding out what's going on in your area specifically?
Well, I think it's important to realise that these government plans are probably the most ambitious I've ever seen. Now, I've worked for the CLA for a long time, since 2002. Before that, I've been involved in agricultural policy making since 1990. I've seen devolution in practice. I've seen what it can do, but also given the fact that what the government is trying to do now, this is probably the most radical change in local decision making since the last major local government reforms back in 1972. But instead of making these changes overnight, which was the case in 1972, today or now it will be a staged process. So as I've said, some areas in England have already submitted their devolution plans to government, such as Sussex, for example, where I presently come from. Some are finalising their proposals, and obviously some have yet to actually start the process. But I think it's important to remember that all counties in England are different. They're unique, they've got different opportunities, they've got different challenges. But it also means that the way that local government will be set up in the future and the areas of focus will inevitably be different, but we don't want them to be too different. And I think this comes back to the need for uniformity, certainly in terms of policy making. And that has actually been recognised by government, because the government has essentially said within the Devolution Bill, which we'll be coming on to, that local authorities need what is called cabinet governance. Essentially, it's the formation of a cabinet of councillors. Each councillor has a portfolio, very much like the present government's cabinet, which is obviously chaired by the Prime Minister. But those portfolios are targeted. They're in explicit policy areas, which I think is a good thing, because it does give this element of uniformity, and it's a form of streamlining local decision making. Now, on the question, well, how do we find out what's actually happening in my area? That will very much depend on what the local authority wants to do. To give you an example, which we know about, in Wiltshire, you have the Wiltshire Combined Authority, or Unitary Authority. Within Wiltshire, anybody who comes from Wiltshire or lives near Wiltshire will know you've got Swindon there. Swindon is in the middle of Wiltshire, but it wants to be different. It doesn't want to join up with the Wiltshire Unitary Authority. It wants to go it on its own. I think what's been interesting in the Swindon case is that it wants to join up with areas you would not normally associate with Swindon, such as Oxford or Gloucester, or areas certainly outside its range of possibilities. Now, all those attempts by Wiltshire Council to actually get involved with others have been rejected, it would appear. So they're going to have to go back to the drawing board. So it's very much a myriad of different options which are being explored. But in the main, if a local authority is seeking to change its structure, it will have a consultation process. It will begin to consult with the local electorate. And I think we'll be going on to what happens to local elections a little later on. So that's a good thing. Consultation with the local electorate is absolutely vital, because it leads to greater transparency, it leads to greater accountability. But it's also the case that the CLA has an important role to play here in terms of informing our members what is actually happening on their patch. And what we're trying to do, the way we're trying to do this, is actually linking up with other groups, such as Britain's Leading Edge, which is collection of local authorities, because by coalition building we can actually influence the policy agenda and the policy process, both at the national and at the local level. So members will be told what's going on, but again, it will be a staggered process.
Okay, I'm going to do my best today's show, try and summarize what you said, that quite long, complicated answer. But I think basically, if you want to know what's going on in your area, have a look at your local authority website, because they should have indicated, what the plan is or what they're intending to do. If you have no joy there, we'd be happy to talk to you in a CLA regional office about what the plan is for your local authority. But it really should be a consultation process with you in the local area. So keep your eyes out what's happening. Henry, an important question to ask you is, what will happen to local elections? Will they change? Will you become voting for a larger area, or will it just stay the same?
We've already seen the impact of these devolution agreements on local authorities this year and votes this year, where 9 local authorities suspended their elections for a couple of years after consultation with government, basically going, we're going to change into a combined authority in the next few years. We don't want to duplicate, and also mainly to save a bit of money. There was a bit of complaints from parties such as Reform and Lib Dems, who saw themselves as likely to win these local elections. So a bit of an idea that democracy being subverted. The most important changes in terms of your local voting and who you're going to vote for is we're going to see the end of district and borough councillors. So right now, if you live in a two-tiered local authority, you might vote for a county councillor as well as a borough or district councillor who basically covers a bit more of a localised area. What's going to happen is we're going to see the end of these district and borough councillors who are going to be absorbed into kind of a unitary authority, meaning that you still have someone representing you, but they're going to represent quite a lot bigger area. They're going to have a bit more power and a bit more budget to do stuff. So we've seen this happen before. So for example, in Dorset, when it went from a two-tier local authority to a unitary authority, they went from 172 local councillors to just 82. There's still representation, you still will be represented, but just by probably one person rather than two.
So next on, I think to both mine and Henry's specialist subject. So the Devolution Bill has entered Westminster. It had its first reading before the summer recess. Henry, could you give us a quick summary of what's in the bill and sort of what it entails?
So I know this phrase has been said a lot in the CLA offices right now, but a bill is very much a framework for devolution. It's not great massive changes by itself. That's going to be a lot that's going to be done within devolution agreements within your local area. But what it's doing is creating a guideline for new mayors, new leaders of strategic authorities, and powers they're allowed to use when devolution happens. It covers a lot of variety of policy areas, quite a lot that have already been devolved in different authorities. So we're seeing stuff around transport, planning, housing, digital infrastructure, all that kind of world. It's a very technical bill, as Charles very much understands after reading it very many times. I don't think it would be a dramatic change compared to the devolution deals that are happening right now.
That's great. Do you think, Charles, that it's going to lead to more powers from the devolution bill, or is it just, as Henry says, a framework to make it understandable about what powers are available?
It's certainly a framework. There's no doubt about that, but it will lead to certain authorities being given new powers and greater powers. But I think it's the case that how these powers are actually going to be used. So the bill states that new structures are going to be introduced with their own targeted budgets and with their own objectives. That will be a decision that the local authorities, whether they be mayoral authorities or combined authorities or unitary authorities, they're going to have to make that decision. I think it's also the case that although the bill doesn't explicitly recognise or state rural, it does give us as the CLA an opportunity of coming back to this whole issue about where the focus is actually getting local authorities to understand how important rural is, how important the rural economy and what role it plays within the national economy. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is actually engaging with local authorities. What we don't want to see are local authorities working on their own and trying to then make the link with local businesses, because what that does is often produce what we call a policy vacuum. There's a gap. We need somebody to fill that gap, and we want to be there to ensure that there is effective engagement, because we know that our members will play a fundamental role in making sure that devolution works, because it is a very, very broad subject, and the bill makes that very, very clear. It's 370 odd pages. And it is one of the, as I said before, it's one of the most radical attempts at changing local government that I've certainly seen. But we need to make sure that we have the links in place. We have the appropriate mechanisms in place so that we can ensure that there is far better engagement than we've seen in the past. What we want to see is essentially within the cabinet structure of these new combined local authorities is a rural cabinet member who has a responsibility for rural issues in that particular local authority. Now that could be he or she could be chair of a rural board, but that structure would then be supported by what we're calling for the creation of rural economic development committees, which are there to advise, there to support. But those committees are made of a wider aspect of the local community, such as rural business representatives and local business people, because they're the ones on the ground who are going to be impacted by these decisions. They're going to be impacted by the range of powers that these new local authorities will actually have. And if we cannot get our foot in the door, so to speak, then that leads to an element of what we call democratic, or you could say there's a deficit of democratic accountability, because all these councillors are elected. They have to be held accountable and electable to the local populace. If that isn't the case and rural is put to one side or sidelined, then I think we have a major problem. So that's why engagement is so vitally important as we move forward.
That brings me on to, if we're talking about elected officials being accountable, how important are mayors? You know, the mayors are the big ticket thing we've been told are going to solve the devolution problem. So how important do you see mayors as being in this conversation?
I think mayors are going to become increasingly important. I think the idea of, if you think of, in the past, what a mayor used to do, they used to, dress up in their regal splendor. They used to, cut the ribbon and open civic buildings. I think they'll still continue doing that, but I think their portfolio of activities and responsibilities are going to be significantly wider. And that's the key. They will have significantly more power than they've probably ever had before. That's why we need to ensure that they understand what rural is, what the rural economy is, and how important it is. We need to have a positive dialogue with all the mayors as they are elected. And you've got to remember, it is essentially a competitive process. It's an election. It will be there will be fought on party political lines. But we need to be aware. But of course, the CLA is an apolitical body. We don't take sides, but we do represent one thing, and that is the protection of our members' interests. And we wouldn't be doing that as well as we'd need to be if we couldn't engage with the mayors and the local authorities. So that is our key objective moving forward.
So, Henry, we spend our day job speaking with MPs. Do you think mayors are going to get to a position where they're actually more powerful than MPs?
So I think, firstly, if you are a CLA member, your local MP is probably the first person you're going to go to. You're going to still go to constituent MP if you have an issue with something. You're not going to go directly to a mayor. But without trying to get too technical, I do think mayors will be more important than the vast majority of MPs. They will be, with their budgets, with their powers, with kind of the ambition the government have with devolution, they're going to be more important than quite a lot of opposition MPs. They're going to be more important than probably a lot of backbench MPs, because they simply just have far more budget and far more remit to make change. The most important thing, however, is I think as a collective, we are seeing a shift to devolution and more local power. Parliament and Westminster will still retain the majority of power. The 650 MPs together will still be the ones to choose legislation, to make national changes, and they will also be able to pull back power from mayors if they feel like it's not going very well or they think there's overreach. So as an individual, I say a mayor will be more important than the majority of MPs, but as a collective, we are moving towards devolution, but it's not quite there yet. We're not in a federal system yet. We're not in the United States.
Okay, so it's a mixed picture. So I think this has been a very helpful conversation, on devolution and looking at where we are and where we're going. But if I'm sat at home as a CLA member, what do I need to take away from this, Charles?
Well, I think we need to understand the importance of devolution. I think, the very fact that we're having this podcast illustrates that point. And CLA members have a vital role to play because they've got to be a real part of the changes which are going to take place. So the first thing that CLA members need to do, they need to understand what devolution is, hence the reason why we're talking now, but also understand what's happening in their local area. And as you've said before, Ellie, we will provide as much information as we can direct to the membership, because we believe it's important that as CLA members get involved in the devolution process, they have the opportunities of making that real change, and as importantly, playing a very active part in the decision-making process, which after all is the actual basis of local democracy. If you don't take part, you can't really complain about decisions which are made which may negatively impact you. So it is vital that as a CLA we help our members, but we also, in a sense, push them to become more actively involved than they already are. We already know that there are a number of CLA members who are involved very greatly in local politics. We want that to continue because they can play a vital role in moving forward.
I think that was very eloquently put, Charles, about how our members can be involved in shaping the devolution agenda. But what is CLA going to do as an organisation, Henry? What are we going to do to make sure that rural areas are listened to as part of this conversation?
So I think a lot of this conversation needs to be split nationally and regionally. And we're already seeing quite a lot of regional engagements and really good regional engagement with local mayors and local combined authorities. So if you went to Great Yorkshire this summer, you might have seen any of the 3 different Yorkshire mayors appear in Great Yorkshire to speak to the CLA team. We were getting meetings with people in Lincolnshire, all that kind of stuff, trying to already engage and work with local mayors and new combined authorities as much as possible. Nationally, which is more kind of what I focus on and me and Eddie focus on together, we are starting a new project that I'm very excited to talk about, which is I work with an all-party parliamentary group on rural business and a rural powerhouse. So we're starting a new inquiry, which is basically with a crossbench group of MPs who run our APPG on rural devolution, trying to get evidence from stakeholders, trying to basically learn from past mistakes in devolution, where it's worked, where it's not worked, and then taking all this evidence together, getting the minister in front of us, talking them through this evidence, creating a report to government, and then using this report to really try to influence mayors as they come into power or new combined authorities, making sure our report is on their front desk so they know what's really important for rural businesses, how not to forget the rural hinterland, and how to work together for the future of CLA members.
I would emphasise how important the APPG work will be because, as Henry said earlier, the bill is the framework. So what we're doing is sort of building upon that and say, here is the best practice for rural areas and how we can make sure that your interests are listened to at a local level and that they don't continue to be ignored. Charles, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think the key point finally is that we have to make sure that we, in a sense, we educate local authorities as to the importance of rural. We need to counter this still very much pervasive policy position within government and in many councils, for that matter, that virtually all growth is urban centric. It isn't, but we've seen this in the past. And rural areas aren't just pretty places to live and visit. It's a lot more than that. We play a very, very important role. As an economist, I look at economies of scale and how important they are, certainly in terms of providing greater efficiencies. But what we're seeing in many urban areas is that those economies of scale are actually being flipped because of challenges to infrastructure, challenges as a result of congestion and social change. And that, of course, impacts the quality of life. We need to have a conversation with local decision makers. We need guidance from national government, which we'll get through the devolution bill. But I would, conclude by saying this is a very, very important opportunity we have as a CLA, not only getting the message across as to the importance of rural and what it means and how important rural economies are, but how important local people are and how they can play their part in local decision making. And because, as I said before, it is the basis of local democracy. And that's why, people died to actually give us the opportunity of voting. So that's why it's important everybody takes an active part, but we do need to get it right. That's why we need to engage.
Thank you, Charles. And I think that's a nice place to end this session today. But I would address that it is an opening gambit. You'll be hearing much more from us on devolution over the coming year, and especially the work of the APPG and any engagement that we do directly with members and put people in front of mayors for so on. But I hope this has been a good start in place. Thank you, Charles and Henry, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.